You're sitting in a dimly lit room, and across from you, someone you've never met before is telling you things about yourself that feel impossibly accurate. They mention a relative whose name starts with J, and you think of your grandmother, Jean. They sense you're at a crossroads in your career, and you've been agonizing over a job offer for weeks. They see a journey in your future, and you've just booked a flight. How do they know these things? Are they truly perceiving information beyond the five senses, or is something else at work? Something equally fascinating about how human minds connect, pattern seek, and find meaning. Welcome back to Midnight Deep Dive, or if you're new here, welcome to our cozy corner of the internet where we explore history's most intriguing phenomena. Tonight, we're stepping into the world of psychics, mediums, and those who claim to perceive what others cannot. We'll journey from ancient temples, where priestesses inhaled mysterious vapors to speak for the gods, into modern times where the debate between science and the supernatural continues. So settle into your most comfortable position, let the day's tensions drift away, and join me as we explore thousands of years of humans claiming to see beyond the veil. Picture yourself in ancient Greece, around 1400 BCE. You've traveled for days, climbing the slopes of Mount Parnassus to reach a sacred sanctuary nestled in the mountains. The air is thin here, crisp and clear, carrying the scent of laurel leaves and burning incense. You're not alone. Pilgrims from across the Mediterranean world have made this same journey, all seeking the same thing, answers. This is Delphi, home to the oracle, and for over 1,000 years, it was considered the center of the world, the place where mortals could speak to the gods and receive divine wisdom. The Oracle of Delphi is perhaps history's most famous psychic institution, and understanding how it worked reveals something profound about the ancient world's relationship with supernatural knowledge. The oracle wasn't a single person, but a position held by a woman called the Pythia. She was typically an older woman from the local area, someone considered pure and suitable to serve as Apollo's mouthpiece. The Pythia would descend into a chamber beneath the temple of Apollo, sit on a bronze tripod placed over a chasm in the earth, and enter a trance state. In this altered consciousness, she would speak in often cryptic, poetic phrases that priests would then interpret for the questioner. What was actually happening in that sacred chamber? For centuries, scholars dismissed the story of vapors rising from the earth as pure mythology. But modern geological surveys of Delphi have revealed something remarkable. The temple sits at the intersection of two fault lines, and these geological features could have released ethylene gas, a sweet-smelling substance that produces a euphoric, trance-like state when inhaled. The Pythia might have genuinely been experiencing altered consciousness, not through divine possession, but through inadvertent intoxication, with natural gases seeping from the earth. But here's what's fascinating. This doesn't diminish the oracle's cultural importance or the very real psychological effect she had on ancient Greek society. Kings and emperors consulted the oracle before major decisions. The oracle's pronouncements influenced wars, shaped political alliances, and guided colonial expansions. Whether the Pythia was channeling Apollo or experiencing gas-induced hallucinations, the institution of the oracle served crucial social functions. It provided a mechanism for decision-making in uncertain times, offered spiritual comfort and connection, and created a shared religious center that bound together the fractious Greek city-states. The questions people brought to Delphi tell us something touching about human concerns across time. They asked about harvests, about whether to marry, about lost loved ones, about choices that weighed on their hearts. The oracle's answers were famously ambiguous. When King Croesus asked if he should attack Persia, the oracle replied that if he crossed the river, a great empire would fall. Croesus attacked, and a great empire did fall, his own. This ambiguity wasn't a bug, it was a feature. It allowed the questioner to find meaning, to interpret divine will in ways that made sense for their situation, to feel guided while ultimately making their own choices. Ancient Egypt had its own rich tradition of divine knowledge and prophecy. Egyptian priests served as intermediaries between the gods and mortals, interpreting dreams, reading omens, and performing divination rituals. The priests of Ra would watch the flight patterns of sacred birds, interpret the shapes of smoke rising from offerings, and examine the organs of sacrificed animals for signs of divine favor or warning. This wasn't considered fortune-telling in the fraudulent sense. It was sacred science, a systematic attempt to understand the will of gods who were believed to actively shape human affairs. Dream interpretation held particular importance in Egyptian culture. They believed dreams were messages from the gods, and they developed elaborate systems for understanding dream symbolism. The Chester Beatty Papyrus, dating to around 1279 BCE, contains one of the oldest surviving dream interpretation guides, listing hundreds of dreams and their meanings. If you dreamed of your teeth falling out, it meant the death of a relative. If you dreamed of drinking warm beer, it meant suffering would come. These interpretations created a framework for understanding the unconscious imagery of sleep, giving people tools to find meaning in their nighttime visions. In Mesopotamia, the birthplace of writing and civilization, divination was a highly developed practice central to governance and daily life. Babylonian priests practiced extispicy, examining the livers, intestines, and other organs of sacrificed sheep to read omens about the future. This wasn't random. They developed detailed systems correlating specific organ characteristics with specific predictions. They kept extensive records, creating what might be considered the world's first databases of divinatory knowledge. If the liver had a particular marking and a certain event followed, that correlation would be noted for future reference. The Babylonians also practiced astrology, developing sophisticated astronomical observations and mathematical calculations to track planetary movements. They believed that celestial events corresponded to earthly affairs, that the gods wrote messages in the movements of stars and planets. This belief drove them to become some of history's most accomplished astronomers, creating star catalogs and planetary tables of remarkable accuracy. Their astrological tradition would eventually spread to Greece, then to Rome, evolving into the Western astrological tradition that persists today. Chinese civilization developed its own elaborate systems for accessing hidden knowledge. The I Ching, or Book of Changes, dating back over 3,000 years, represents one of humanity's oldest and most sophisticated divination systems. It's based on the idea that reality is in constant flux, that everything changes according to underlying patterns, and that by understanding these patterns, one can navigate life more wisely. To consult the I Ching, one would traditionally use yarrow stalks or coins, generating a series of random results that would point to one of 64 hexagrams, each with associated wisdom and guidance. What's remarkable about the I Ching is that it's simultaneously a divination tool and a philosophical text. The hexagrams don't predict specific events so much as describe situations and their inherent dynamics, suggesting appropriate responses and likely developments. It's less you will meet a tall stranger, and more you're in a situation characterized by these energies. Here's what this moment calls for. This reflects a distinctly Chinese philosophical approach that sees fate and free will not as opposites, but as interacting forces. Chinese culture also developed Feng Shui, a system for arranging spaces in harmony with qi, the vital energy believed to flow through all things. Feng Shui practitioners, working as advisors to emperors and common people alike, would analyze landscapes, building orientations, and interior arrangements to optimize the flow of beneficial energy. While modern science doesn't recognize qi as a measurable force, Feng Shui's principles often align with practical concerns about light, airflow, and psychological comfort in spaces. Indigenous cultures worldwide developed their own traditions of accessing supernatural knowledge, typically centered on shamanic practices. Shamans were individuals believed to have special abilities to communicate with the spirit world, often through ecstatic trance states induced by drumming, dancing, fasting, or entheogenic plants. In Siberian cultures, which gave us the word shaman, these practitioners would enter altered states to journey to spirit realms, seeking healing knowledge, finding lost objects, or communicating with ancestors. Native American tribes had diverse practices, but many shared the concept of vision quests. Young people would go alone into the wilderness, fast, and seek visions that would provide guidance and spiritual power. These visions, whether interpreted as genuine spiritual contact or as psychological experiences produced by isolation, hunger, and exposure, served important social functions. They marked transitions to adulthood, provided personal direction, and connected individuals to their culture's spiritual traditions. Australian Aboriginal cultures maintained perhaps the world's oldest continuous spiritual traditions, including practices for accessing dreamtime knowledge. Clever men and women, recognized for their spiritual abilities, served as healers, advisors, and keepers of sacred knowledge. They claimed abilities to see distant events, find water in desert landscapes, and communicate with ancestral spirits. Their knowledge was passed down through elaborate oral traditions, encoded in stories, songs, and art that served as maps, histories, and spiritual guides. What unites all these ancient practices is a worldview very different from modern Western secular thinking. Ancient peoples didn't separate the physical and spiritual, the natural and supernatural. The gods were real, spirits existed, and certain individuals could access knowledge from beyond ordinary perception. This wasn't superstition in the dismissive sense. It was a comprehensive framework for understanding reality, making decisions, and finding meaning in a world full of genuine uncertainty and mystery. These ancient psychic traditions served vital social functions. They provided mechanisms for decision-making when information was limited and consequences were serious. They offered comfort in grief and uncertainty. They created social cohesion through shared spiritual practices. They gave certain individuals, often women or outsiders who might otherwise lack power, important social roles and status. And they acknowledged something psychologically true, that humans have intuitions, gut feelings, and unconscious perceptions that can't always be rationally explained, but sometimes prove valuable. As the ancient world gave way to medieval Europe, the relationship between supernatural knowledge and social power shifted dramatically. The rise of Christianity created new categories for understanding psychic phenomena. Revelations could be divine gifts from God, demonic deceptions from Satan, or dangerous superstitions to be suppressed. The same abilities that might make someone a saint in one context could condemn them as a witch in another. This era reveals how cultural frameworks shape not just how we interpret psychic claims, but whether we celebrate or execute those who make them. Medieval Christian mystics occupied a fascinating space in this landscape. These were individuals, often women, who claimed direct spiritual experiences, visions of Jesus, Mary, or saints, prophetic dreams, or states of religious ecstasy. The Church treated such claims with deep ambivalence. Genuine divine revelation was possible, theologians agreed, but so was demonic deception and human delusion. The challenge was distinguishing between them, and the criteria often had more to do with politics and power than the content of the visions themselves. Hildegard of Bingen, who lived from 1098 to 1179, represents one of the most remarkable medieval mystics whose visions won church approval. She began experiencing visions as a young child, brilliant lights, complex symbolic imagery, voices speaking divine wisdom. As an adult, she recorded these visions in elaborate texts, creating theological works, medical treatises, and compositions of sacred music. Her visions gave her authority to speak on matters typically reserved for male clergy, to correspond with popes and emperors, and to influence theological debates. What protected Hildegard from accusations of witchcraft or demonic possession was partly her status. She was a Benedictine abbess operating within approved church structures, but it was also how she framed her experiences. She emphasized her own unworthiness, her reluctance to speak, and positioned herself as merely a vessel for God's message. This humble framing, combined with theological orthodoxy in her content, made her visions acceptable. She claimed no power of her own, only service to divine will. But Hildegard's visions might have had a more mundane explanation that doesn't diminish their historical importance. Modern medical analysis of her descriptions suggests she may have suffered from migraine auras, the visual disturbances that often precede migraine headaches. Her drawings of her visions show patterns remarkably similar to what migraine sufferers describe: fortification spectra, shimmering lights, and geometric patterns. Whether Hildegard was experiencing divine revelation or neurological phenomena, her visions were real experiences that she interpreted through her culture's available framework, and they gave her a voice and influence remarkable for a medieval woman. Joan of Arc represents the tragic side of medieval mysticism. Born around 1412, Joan began hearing voices at age 13. She identified them as Saints Michael, Catherine, and Margaret. These voices gave her a mission: to help the French Dauphin reclaim his throne from English occupation. Remarkably, she convinced military leaders to give her armor and let her accompany troops, and her presence at the siege of Orel-et-Tilde copyright Anne's helped turn the tide of the 100 Years' War. But Joan's visions, which had made her a hero, eventually condemned her. Captured by English allies, she was tried for heresy. The same visions that the French had celebrated as divine were reframed as demonic or delusional. She was burned at the stake at age 19. The Church later reversed her condemnation, eventually canonizing her as a saint. Joan's story reveals how claims of supernatural knowledge are judged not by their content, but by their political context. The same visions could be holy or heretical, depending on who held power. While Christian mystics navigated church approval, other forms of supernatural knowledge operated in medieval society's shadows and margins. Cunning folk, also called wise women or wise men, practiced throughout medieval and early modern Europe. These were local people, often illiterate, who claimed abilities to heal, find lost objects, identify thieves, protect against witchcraft, and see the future. They occupied an ambiguous space. The Church officially condemned their practices as superstition, but common people relied on them extensively, and local clergy often looked the other way. The services cunning folk provided reveal what ordinary people wanted from supernatural knowledge. They wanted sick children healed, lost animals found, thieves identified, and protection from malevolent magic. They wanted love potions, fertility charms, and glimpses of future spouses. These weren't abstract theological questions, but practical concerns of daily survival and human desire. Cunning folk filled a need that neither the distant church nor the emerging medical profession adequately addressed. The methods cunning folk used drew from pre-Christian traditions mixed with Christian elements. They might divine by reading patterns in melted wax or lead poured into water, by interpreting the flight of birds, by casting lots, or by entering trance states. They used charms and rituals that invoked Christian saints and angels alongside older folk practices. This syncretism, the blending of Christian and pagan elements, was common in medieval popular religion, though it made church authorities nervous. The witch trials of the early modern period, roughly 1450 to 1750, created an atmosphere of terror around claims of supernatural knowledge and power. Between 40,000 and 60,000 people, mostly women, were executed for witchcraft during this period. The accusations often involved claims of seeing spirits, prophesying, or performing magic. What had been ambiguously tolerated cunning folk practices became reframed as diabolical witchcraft, and the difference between a healer and a witch often came down to local politics, personal grudges, and whether accusations gained momentum. The Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487, codified the theological and legal framework for witch persecution. This text claimed that witches gained their powers through pacts with the devil, that they could fly through the air, transform into animals, and cause harm through supernatural means. It provided detailed instructions for identifying and interrogating suspected witches, including torture methods to extract confessions. This document transformed supernatural claims from religious matters into criminal offenses requiring brutal prosecution. What's tragic is that many accused witches probably did practice some form of folk magic or healing. They might have claimed abilities to see the future, communicate with spirits, or heal through supernatural means. In earlier eras, these claims might have made them valued community members. But as theological and political winds shifted, the same claims and practices became capital crimes. The witch trials reveal how dangerously claims of psychic or supernatural abilities can be weaponized in contexts of social anxiety and power struggles. Simultaneously, the Renaissance brought renewed interest in ancient esoteric traditions and a more philosophical approach to supernatural knowledge. Scholars recovered Greek, Roman, and Egyptian texts on magic, astrology, and divination. Figures like Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola attempted to reconcile these ancient traditions with Christianity, arguing that all truth ultimately came from God, whether through scripture, ancient wisdom, or mystical revelation. This period gave birth to what we might call learned magic, complex systems of correspondences, symbols, and rituals practiced by educated elites. This was very different from cunning folk traditions. It involved elaborate studies of astrology, alchemy, Kabbalah, and ceremonial magic, all framed in philosophical and theological language. Practitioners weren't claiming to traffic with demons, but to understand the hidden structures of creation and work with natural, if invisible, forces. And then there's Nostradamus, perhaps the Renaissance's most famous prophet. Michel de Nostradame, born in 1503, was a physician and astrologer who published a book of prophetic quatrains, 4-line verses describing future events in cryptic, symbolic language. His predictions were sufficiently vague that they've been retrospectively applied to countless historical events, from the Great Fire of London to the rise of Hitler, from the French Revolution to the September 11 attacks. Nostradamus's enduring fame reveals something important about prophecy. Ambiguity is powerful. Specific, testable predictions can be proven wrong, but vague, symbolic imagery can be reinterpreted to fit whatever events occur. Nostradamus wrote of the young lion overcoming the old in single combat, which was applied to the death of French King Henry II in a jousting accident. He wrote of the great star burning for 7 days, which some claim predicted a comet, others claim predicted nuclear weapons. This interpretive flexibility makes his prophecies simultaneously unfalsifiable and endlessly fascinating. What's often forgotten is that Nostradamus was working within an established tradition of Renaissance astrology and prophecy. He calculated astrological charts, studied celestial patterns, and framed his visions in the mystical and symbolic language of his era. Whether he genuinely believed he was seeing the future or was crafting deliberately ambiguous verses that would ensure his fame, he understood something about human psychology. We're pattern-seeking creatures who find meaning in symbols and feel comforted by the idea that the future, however uncertain, follows patterns we might comprehend. The medieval and Renaissance periods reveal how claims of supernatural knowledge become entangled with power, politics, religion, and gender. The same abilities could make you a saint or a witch, a valued advisor or a condemned heretic. What determined your fate wasn't the nature of your visions or abilities, but how they aligned with the interests of those who held power. This era shows us that psychic claims are never just about individual experiences. They're about social contexts that determine how such experiences are interpreted, valued, or punished. March 31st, 1848, in a small wooden house in Hydesville, New York, something happened that would change the relationship between the living and the dead, or at least change millions of people's belief about that relationship. Two young sisters, Kate and Margaret Fox, claimed they'd made contact with a spirit who communicated through mysterious knocking sounds. This simple claim, that the dead could communicate with the living through mediums who served as intermediaries, sparked a movement that swept across America and Europe, transforming grief, entertaining the masses, and creating a new profession that would shape how we think about psychic abilities for the next century and beyond. The Fox sisters' story began with strange noises. Their family had been hearing unexplained knocking and rapping sounds in their house, sounds that seemed to respond to questions. Kate and Margaret, aged 11 and 14, claimed they could communicate with the source of these sounds. A spirit they believed was a murdered peddler buried in their basement. They developed a code: 1 knock for yes, 2 for no, and a system for spelling out words by knocking through the alphabet. Word spread quickly. Neighbors came to witness the phenomenon. The girl's older sister, Lee, recognized opportunity and began organizing public demonstrations. Within months, the Fox sisters were performing seances for paying audiences, and within a few years, they traveled to major cities, demonstrating their abilities to crowds of curious believers and skeptics. They sparked a phenomenon that would come to be called spiritualism, and its growth was explosive. Why did spiritualism catch fire when and where it did? To understand this, we need to understand mid-19th century America and Europe. This was an era of tremendous change and uncertainty. The Industrial Revolution was transforming society, traditional communities were breaking apart, and people were moving to cities far from their families and roots. Death was ever present. Infant mortality was high, diseases struck suddenly, and average lifespans were far shorter than today. Almost everyone experienced the death of children, parents, siblings, or spouses. Traditional Christianity offered comfort about the afterlife, but for many, it wasn't enough. The doctrine of heaven and hell seemed harsh. Loved ones might be eternally separated based on religious technicalities. Church rituals felt distant and formal. People wanted more direct connection, more personal comfort, more proof that their dead loved ones still existed and were okay. Spiritualism promised exactly this. You could speak to your departed relatives, receive messages from them, know they were at peace and still loved you. The movement also emerged in a context of social reform and progressive thinking. Early spiritualists were often involved in abolition, women's rights, and other reform movements. Spiritualism offered a democratized approach to the divine. You didn't need priests or official church sanction to communicate with the spirit world. Mediums could be anyone, and they often were women, giving female practitioners spiritual authority and public platforms rare in that era. The movement attracted free thinkers, reformers, and those questioning traditional religious and social hierarchies. Seances became the central practice of spiritualism. In darkened parlors across America and Europe, groups would gather around tables, holding hands, while a medium would enter a trance state and claim to channel spirits of the deceased. The phenomena reported at seances were remarkable. Tables would levitate, mysterious lights would appear, musical instruments would play themselves, and most importantly, messages would come from the dead. Sometimes through the medium's voice, sometimes through knocking or writing, and sometimes through spectacular physical manifestations. The variety of mediumship practices that developed during this era reveals both creativity and the movement's deep appeal. Some mediums produced spirit writing, where the deceased supposedly guided the medium's hand to write messages. Others channeled spirits who spoke through them in different voices, sometimes in languages the medium claimed not to know. Physical mediums produced dramatic phenomena, objects moving without being touched, ectoplasm supposedly emanating from their bodies, full-bodied apparitions of spirits materializing in seance rooms. Among the most famous mediums was Daniel Dungla's Home, who never charged for his seances, and whose demonstrations seemed impossible to explain through trickery. Home reportedly levitated in front of witnesses, produced spirit hands that could be touched, and handled hot coals without being burned. He was tested by scientists and investigators, and many came away convinced his abilities were genuine. No one ever definitively proved he was fraudulent, though skeptics insisted there must be tricks they simply hadn't detected. The Davenport brothers created elaborate stage shows featuring what they claimed were spirit phenomena. Tied up in a cabinet with musical instruments, the brothers would produce sounds, manifestations, and movements that seemed impossible given their restraints. Their performances blur the line between seance and entertainment, between religious experience and theatrical spectacle. They never explicitly claimed to be fraudulent entertainers, but they presented their phenomena in theatrical venues for paying audiences, creating ambiguity about whether they were spiritual mediums or clever magicians. The British medium Florence Cook produced full-bodied materializations of a spirit she called Katie King. During seances in the 1870s, Cook would enter a cabinet, and Katie King would emerge, walking among sitters, speaking to them, allowing herself to be touched and examined. The famous scientist William Crookes investigated Cook extensively and declared her phenomena genuine, even though other investigators suspected that Katie King was simply Cook herself, having slipped out of her restraints and dressed in white robes. This brings us to a crucial aspect of the spiritualist movement: fraud. While some mediums genuinely believed they were channeling spirits, many others were deliberate frauds, using tricks and techniques to simulate supernatural phenomena. The methods they used were often ingeniously simple. Seances were held in darkness, which allowed for sleight of hand and concealed confederates. Tables could be made to rap or tip through subtle manipulation or hidden mechanisms. Spirit voices could be produced through ventriloquism. Ectoplasm was often nothing more than cheesecloth, which could be hidden in the medium's body or clothing and then revealed at the right moment. The most poignant revelation came in 1888, when Margaret Fox, one of the original Fox sisters, confessed that their spirit communications had been fraudulent from the beginning. She demonstrated on stage how she and her sister Kate had produced the knocking sounds by cracking their toe joints, a skill they'd developed as children. The entire spiritualist movement, she claimed, had been founded on a prank that had gotten out of hand. Margaret later recanted her confession, claiming she'd been pressured and was drunk when she made it. But the damage to spiritualism's credibility was significant. Yet here's what's remarkable. Even after this confession, spiritualism continued. Believers argued that while the Fox sisters might have been fraudulent, that didn't invalidate the experiences of millions of people who'd found comfort in communicating with their dead loved ones. The movement had grown far beyond its origins, encompassing thousands of mediums, organizations, churches, and devoted followers. It had become a community, a belief system, and for many, a source of genuine spiritual comfort that confession couldn't simply erase. The question of fraud versus genuine phenomena divided investigators throughout the spiritualist era. Harry Houdini, the famous magician and escape artist, became one of spiritualism's most dedicated debunkers. Having lost his beloved mother, Houdini desperately wanted to believe that communication with the dead was possible. He attended hundreds of seances, hoping to contact his mother, but found only fraud. Mediums used tricks he recognized from his own stage magic. And when he couldn't detect the method, careful investigation always revealed trickery eventually. Houdini became crusader against fraudulent mediums, particularly those who exploited the grief of bereaved families. He demonstrated how seance phenomena could be replicated through magic tricks, published exposés of mediums' techniques, and even testified before Congress advocating for laws against fraudulent fortune-telling. His campaign was personal. He felt betrayed by mediums who'd taken advantage of his grief, and he wanted to protect others from the same exploitation. But Houdini's friend Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, became one of spiritualism's most devoted advocates. Doyle had lost his son in World War I, and spiritualism provided comfort and connection he desperately needed. He attended seances, received messages he believed were from his son, and became convinced that at least some mediums possessed genuine abilities. The friendship between Houdini and Doyle became strained by their disagreement. Houdini the skeptic and Doyle the believer, neither able to convince the other. The split between Houdini and Doyle exemplifies a broader tension that continues today. For skeptics, the existence of fraud proves all psychic claims are fraudulent. If some mediums use tricks, all must be tricksters. For believers, the existence of fraud doesn't disprove all phenomena. Just because some mediums are fake doesn't mean all are. Both positions are defensible, and the debate continues because the question can't be definitively resolved to everyone's satisfaction. What's often overlooked in discussions of spiritualism is the genuine comfort it provided to millions of grieving people. Whether or not the dead actually communicated, the experience of feeling connected to lost loved ones, of receiving messages of continued love and peace, of believing that death wasn't final separation. These experiences were psychologically real and meaningful. Spiritualism gave people a framework for processing grief, a community of others who'd experienced loss, and rituals that made mourning feel less isolating. The movement also provided opportunities for women that were rare in 19th century society. Female mediums could speak publicly, earn independent income, and claim spiritual authority in ways that would have been impossible in most other contexts. Some historians argue that spiritualism was partly a feminist movement in disguise, giving women voices and power through claims of channeling spirits. Whether the spirits were real or not, the social changes, women speaking, women leading, women earning, were undeniably real. By the early 20th century, spiritualism's influence began to wane, though it never completely disappeared. The movement had been damaged by fraud exposés, by scientific investigations that found no evidence of genuine supernatural phenomena, and by changing cultural attitudes. But it had fundamentally shaped how modern Western culture thinks about psychic abilities. The idea of mediums as intermediaries between worlds, the notion that some people have special abilities to perceive what others can't, the practice of seeking messages from beyond. All these became part of the cultural landscape through spiritualism. Spiritualist churches still exist today, maintaining practices of mediumship and spirit communication. Modern mediums like John Edward and Teresa Caputo draw directly from the spiritualist tradition, using similar language and techniques, offering the same comfort to the bereaved that 19th century mediums provided. The fundamental appeal hasn't changed. Humans want to know that death isn't the end, that love continues beyond the grave, that we might speak once more to those we've lost. The early 20th century brought a fascinating paradox. Just as science was revealing the fundamental nature of reality through quantum mechanics and relativity, just as the modern world was becoming more rational and technological, some scientists began seriously investigating whether the human mind might possess abilities that transcended known physical laws. These researchers weren't mystical spiritualists or religious devotees. They were academics with PhDs, working in universities, applying scientific methodology to questions about telepathy, clairvoyance, and psychokinesis. What they discovered, or failed to discover, tells us as much about the challenges of studying consciousness as it does about psychic phenomena themselves. The Society for Psychical Research, founded in London in 1882, represented the first serious attempt to investigate paranormal claims using scientific methods. The founding members were impressive. Henry Sidgwick, professor of moral philosophy at Cambridge, William Barrett, professor of physics at the Royal College of Science in Dublin, and Edmund Gurney, a fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge. These weren't fringe figures or credulous believers. They were respected academics who believed that reports of telepathy, hauntings, and mediumship deserved systematic investigation rather than automatic dismissal. The SBR's early work focused on collecting and analyzing spontaneous cases. People's reports of telepathic experiences, premonitions that came true, or encounters with apparitions. They sent out questionnaires, interviewed witnesses, and tried to distinguish between genuine unexplained phenomena and cases that could be explained through coincidence, fraud, or psychological factors. What they found was thousands of reported experiences, some quite compelling, but always the challenge of verification. How do you prove that someone genuinely received telepathic information rather than making a lucky guess or unconsciously picking up subtle cues? One of the SBR's most famous investigations involved the medium Leonora Piper, who came to their attention in the 1880s. Unlike many mediums who worked in darkness with dramatic physical phenomena, Piper worked in normal light and provided detailed, specific information about deceased individuals that seemed impossible to explain through normal means. She would enter a trance state and claim to channel spirits who would then provide information to sitters. Names, relationships, personal details, and messages. The SBR investigated Piper extensively, including having her travel to England, where she couldn't possibly have prior knowledge of the sitters. They hired private investigators to follow her and ensure she wasn't researching her clients beforehand. William James, the renowned psychologist and philosopher, was among those who investigated Piper and came away convinced that her abilities couldn't be explained by fraud or cold reading. Yet even James remained cautious, noting that proving survival after death was far more difficult than simply demonstrating that Piper had access to information through unknown means. The challenge the SBR faced, and that all subsequent parapsychological research has faced, is the difficulty of proving a negative and the problem of experimental control. If a medium provides accurate information, there are always potential normal explanations. Subtle cues from the sitter, prior research, lucky guesses, or the psychological tendency to remember hits and forget misses. To prove psychic ability exists, you need to eliminate all these possibilities, which is extraordinarily difficult. And even one successful demonstration doesn't establish that the phenomenon is reliable or replicable. In the 1930s, a botanist named J.B. Rhine at Duke University began what would become the most sustained attempt to study psychic phenomena in laboratory conditions. Rhine coined the term extrasensory perception, ESP, and designed experiments specifically to test whether people could acquire information without using their known senses. His most famous work involved Zener cards, a special deck of 25 cards with 5 symbols: circle, square, wavy lines, cross, and star. In a typical experiment, one person would look at the cards one at a time while another person, separated from them, would try to guess which symbol was being viewed. Rhine's early results seemed promising. Some test subjects, whom he called high scorers, consistently guessed correctly at rates significantly above the 20% expected by chance. The odds against some of these results occurring by random chance were astronomical, thousands or even millions to one. Rhine published his findings in 1934 in a book called Extrasensory Perception, and it created a sensation. Here, finally, seemed to be scientific proof of psychic abilities. But Rhine's work faced immediate and sustained criticism from other scientists. Critics pointed out methodological problems, inadequate controls against sensory cues, statistical errors, selective reporting of successful trials while ignoring unsuccessful ones, and the problem of what became known as the decline effect. Rhine's high scorers tended to perform at chance levels when tested by skeptical investigators, or when experiments were repeated over time. If ESP were a real phenomenon like gravity or electricity, why did it seem to work only under certain conditions and disappear when skeptics looked too closely? Rhine and his defenders argued that ESP was real but fragile, that it required belief and positive conditions to manifest, and that skeptical investigators created psychological atmospheres that inhibited the phenomenon. Critics responded that this made ESP unfalsifiable. If it only worked when believers were testing believers, how was this different from wishful thinking or unconscious bias? The debate created a pattern that continues in parapsychology today. Suggestive results that proponents find compelling, but that never quite convince the broader scientific community. The Gonsfeld experiments, developed in the 1970s, represented a more sophisticated attempt to test ESP. The basic procedure involved placing a receiver in a state of mild sensory deprivation. Half ping-pong balls over their eyes, headphones playing white noise, reclining in a comfortable chair. Meanwhile, a sender in another room would concentrate on a randomly selected image or video clip. The receiver would describe their impressions, and later, judges would determine whether these descriptions matched the target better than they matched control images. Initial Gonsfeld studies reported success rates significantly above chance, and meta-analyses of multiple studies seemed to show a small but consistent effect. Proponents argued this was finally strong evidence for ESP, but again, methodological criticisms emerged. Inadequate randomization of targets, potential for subtle sensory cues, problems with how judges evaluated matches, and issues with publication bias. The tendency for positive results to be published, while negative results remained in file drawers. What's particularly interesting from a psychological perspective is how differently believers and skeptics interpret the same data. Proponents of ESP point to meta-analyses showing small but statistically significant effects across many studies. Skeptics argue that these small effects are exactly what you'd expect from methodological flaws and publication bias. That if ESP were real, the effects should be larger and more consistent. Both interpretations of the data are defensible, which is why the debate continues. Modern neuroscience has approached the question from a different angle. If psychic abilities exist, what brain mechanisms could possibly support them? The brain operates through electrochemical processes that are increasingly well understood. Information enters through sensory organs, is processed through neural networks, and produces thoughts and behaviors. Where in this system could telepathy or clairvoyance occur? How would the brain detect or transmit information without any known physical medium? Some researchers have proposed that quantum effects in the brain might allow for non-local information transfer. Essentially, that the spooky action at a distance observed in quantum entanglement might somehow operate in neural systems. However, most neuroscientists consider this unlikely. The brain is warm, wet, and noisy, not the conditions where quantum coherence typically persists. And even if quantum effects did occur, there's no known mechanism by which they could transmit specific information like thoughts or images between brains. The challenge for scientific investigation of psychic phenomena is what's called the experimenter effect. In physics, you can measure gravity regardless of whether the experimenter believes in gravity. The phenomenon is reliable, consistent, and independent of expectations. But if psychic abilities, by their nature, are influenced by belief, expectation, and psychological state, they resist the kind of objective measurement science requires. This doesn't mean they don't exist, but it does mean they occupy an uncomfortable space that's difficult for science to address. What modern psychology has revealed, though, is how easily we can be fooled into believing we've experienced psychic phenomena. Confirmation bias causes us to notice and remember apparent hits while forgetting misses. The Texas sharpshooter fallacy makes us draw targets around random bullet holes and claim impressive accuracy. Our brains are pattern detection machines, so good at finding meaningful patterns that we often see them where none exist. These cognitive biases don't prove psychic phenomena are impossible, but they do explain why personal experiences of seemingly psychic events are so common, while scientific validation remains elusive. Despite decades of research and millions of dollars spent, parapsychology has failed to convince mainstream science that psychic phenomena exist. No psychic ability has been reliably demonstrated under controlled conditions. No mechanism has been identified that could support telepathy, clairvoyance, or psychokinesis, given our current understanding of physics and neuroscience. Most scientists today consider parapsychology a pseudoscience, more akin to alchemy than chemistry. Yet research continues. The Parapsychological Association is an affiliate of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Universities like the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies continue investigating phenomena related to consciousness and possible survival after death. Researchers continue to publish in specialized journals, continue to refine methodologies, and continue to report suggestive findings. Whether this represents genuine science investigating underappreciated phenomena or a field trapped in a dead end remains hotly debated. Imagine you're sitting across from a psychic reader. They've never met you before, yet within minutes, they're telling you things about yourself that feel impossibly accurate. I'm sensing a father figure, someone whose name begins with J or maybe a hard G sound. He passed when there were things left unsaid between you. Your jaw drops. Your father John died 5 years ago, and you've been carrying guilt about your last conversation. How could this stranger possibly know? Welcome to the world of cold reading, one of the most fascinating intersections of psychology, performance, and human nature. Cold reading is the art of making statements that feel specific and personal, while actually being general enough to apply to most people, then using the subject's reactions to guide the reading toward apparent accuracy. It's not supernatural, but when done well, it can feel absolutely magical. Understanding cold reading doesn't diminish psychic experiences. Instead, it reveals something beautiful about human nature, our desperate need for connection, and how meaning emerges from interaction. The foundation of cold reading is what psychologists call the Barnum effect, named after the showman P.T. Barnum. This is our tendency to accept vague, general personality descriptions as uniquely applicable to ourselves. The psychologist Bertram Forer demonstrated this brilliantly in 1948. He gave his students a personality test, then returned to each student what he claimed were their individual results. Students rated the accuracy of their personality descriptions as remarkably high, averaging 4.26 out of 5. The twist: every student received exactly the same description, composed of statements Forer had pulled from newspaper horoscopes. The description included statements like, "You have a great need for other people to like and admire you. You have a tendency to be critical of yourself. At times you have serious doubts as to whether you have made the right decision or done the right thing. And while you have some personality weaknesses, you are generally able to compensate for them." Read these statements. Don't they feel personally accurate? Yet they're true for almost everyone, phrased to sound specific while remaining universally applicable. Skilled cold readers build on this foundation with observation and probability. They notice your clothing, jewelry, accent, age, and body language, making educated guesses about your socioeconomic status, education level, likely concerns, and life experiences. A young woman wearing an engagement ring probably has relationship questions. An older person with a medical alert bracelet likely has health concerns. Someone dressed in business attire during weekday afternoon is probably dealing with career stress. These aren't psychic insights. They're reasonable inferences from observable data. The real art of cold reading lies in how statements are phrased and delivered. Rather than making definite claims, skilled readers use tentative language that allows for multiple interpretations. I'm sensing something about the chest area, perhaps heart problems, or maybe breathing difficulties, or possibly someone carried emotional weight, held things in their chest. This covers multiple possibilities, and whatever the subject responds to becomes the accurate reading. The shotgun technique involves firing off multiple general statements rapidly, knowing some will hit. I'm getting the letter M, or maybe N. There's someone older, a grandmother figure perhaps, or maybe an aunt. Concerns about the home, and I'm sensing water, maybe a flood or plumbing problems or someone who lived near water. Subjects typically grab onto whatever resonates and ignore what doesn't, remembering the hits and forgetting the misses. Rainbow ruse is a particularly clever technique where you make a statement that credits the subject with both a trait and its opposite. Most of the time you're very confident and outgoing, but sometimes, especially around certain people, you can be quite shy and reserved. This works because human personality is complex and contextual. We all behave differently in different situations, so statements acknowledging this duality always feel true. The Jacques statement, named after a routine by mentalist Al-Quran, involves making a statement that sounds specific, but actually applies to almost everyone. I see you have a scar on your left knee. Most people do have scars somewhere on their body, and if they don't have one on the left knee specifically, they'll often helpfully correct you. Not my left knee, but I do have a scar on my right elbow. The reader then acts as if they'd been close, and the subject credits them with accuracy. What makes cold reading work isn't just technique, it's the psychology of the interaction. People consulting psychics are often in emotional states where they want to believe. They're seeking answers, comfort, or connection. They're motivated to find meaning in the reading, to make connections, to interpret vague statements in personally significant ways. This isn't stupidity or gullibility. It's the human meaning-making capacity at work. The feedback loop between reader and subject is crucial. When a reader makes a statement, they watch carefully for the subject's reaction. Microexpressions, body language, verbal responses. If the subject shows recognition or agreement, the reader continues in that direction, adding details and making it seem like they're receiving psychic information when they're actually reading feedback. If the subject shows confusion or disagreement, the reader pivots to a different interpretation or moves to a new topic entirely. Magician and skeptic Ian Rowland, who wrote the definitive book on cold reading, identifies several types of readings. The character reading focuses on personality traits and life patterns. The problem reading addresses specific concerns or decisions. The prediction reading makes statements about the future. Each type uses similar techniques but frames them differently. What's remarkable is how consistent these techniques are across cultures and contexts, from carnival fortune tellers to expensive celebrity psychics. Modern psychic mediums often use a technique called hot reading, which isn't really a reading at all but research. Before a session, the medium might Google the client, check social media, or gather information through accomplices. When the medium then reveals details about the client's life, the client assumes it's psychic ability when it's actually just good investigative work. Some mediums who appear on television have been caught using this technique, with leaked audio revealing them receiving information through hidden earpieces. But here's what's fascinating. Even when people know about cold reading techniques, they often still find the experience meaningful. Darren Brown, the British mentalist, explicitly tells audiences he uses psychological techniques, not psychic powers. Yet people who receive readings from him still report feeling that the experience was powerful and personally significant. The techniques work even when you know they're techniques, because the need for connection and meaning is so fundamental. The question becomes, are all psychics using cold reading, or might some have genuine abilities that they supplement with these techniques? Most skeptics argue that cold reading, along with research and probability, explains all psychic readings. If someone appears to have psychic abilities, they're either using these techniques consciously, or have internalized them so thoroughly they genuinely believe they're receiving supernatural information. Some psychologists suggest that intuitive people might unconsciously use cold reading techniques while genuinely believing they're experiencing psychic phenomena. They're noticing subtle cues, making quick intuitive leaps, and accessing information through excellent observational skills and emotional intelligence. Their brains are doing sophisticated information processing, but they experience and interpret it as psychic insight rather than naturalistic skill. What's undeniable is that people who receive psychic readings often report positive experiences. They feel heard, understood, and validated. They receive comfort in grief or clarity about decisions. Whether the mechanism is supernatural or psychological, the effect can be therapeutic. This raises ethical questions. Is it wrong to provide comfort through techniques that aren't supernatural if people find value in the experience? Or does the deception, claiming psychic ability when using learned techniques, make it inherently exploitative? Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, certain individuals have captured public imagination through claims of extraordinary psychic abilities. These people, whether genuine, fraudulent, or something in between, have shaped cultural understanding of what psychics can supposedly do and how they operate. Their stories reveal the complex interplay between belief, performance, skepticism, and the very human desire to believe that some people possess abilities beyond the ordinary. Let's meet some of the most famous psychics of the modern era, examining their claims, their impact, and what we know about their accuracy. Edgar Cayce, known as the Sleeping Prophet, operated from 1910 until his death in 1945, and he remains one of the most fascinating figures in psychic history. Cayce's method was unique. He would lie on a couch, enter what appeared to be a self-induced trance state, and then supposedly access a universal consciousness he called the Akashic Records. While in trance, he would speak in a different voice, offering detailed medical diagnoses and treatment recommendations for people he'd never met, sometimes located hundreds of miles away. What made Cayce particularly interesting was his sincerity and the documented cases where his recommendations apparently helped people. He didn't seek wealth or fame, charging minimal fees and often giving free readings. Thousands of his readings were stenographically recorded, creating an archive that researchers have studied extensively. In these readings, Cayce would diagnose conditions, recommend specific herbal remedies or treatments, and describe the spiritual causes of physical ailments. Some of Cayce's remedies were ahead of his time. He recommended dietary changes, exercise, and holistic approaches that aligned with later developments in medicine. He suggested specific herbal treatments that modern research has found to have genuine therapeutic properties, but many of his recommendations were bizarre. He claimed that peanut oil could prevent arthritis, that wearing copper could heal various conditions, and that castor oil packs were cure-alls for numerous ailments. The challenge with Cayce is verification. The Association for Research and Enlightenment, founded to preserve his work, claims high success rates for his readings. But independent analysis is difficult because medical records from that era are incomplete. Success might be explained by placebo effects or the natural course of diseases, and the readings themselves were often vague enough to be interpreted multiple ways. Cayce represents the sincere believer category. Someone who genuinely seemed to believe in his abilities and wasn't motivated primarily by profit, yet whose claims remain difficult to verify objectively. Jean Dixon gained fame in 1950s and 60s America, becoming the most famous psychic of her era. Her celebrity rested largely on what seemed like a remarkable prediction. In 1956, she allegedly predicted that the 1960 presidential election would be won by a Democrat who would die in office. When John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, Dixon's reputation was made. She became a sought-after advisor to politicians and celebrities, wrote a syndicated astrology column, and published several books about her psychic abilities. But here's the problem. Dixon made thousands of predictions, most of which were wrong. She predicted World War III would begin in 1958. She said the USSR would be the first nation to put men on the moon. She predicted that labor leader Jimmy Hoffa would be found alive in 1975. She claimed that a cure for cancer would be found in 1967. For every prediction that seemed to hit, dozens missed completely. This phenomenon, focusing on hits while ignoring misses, became known as the Jeane Dixon effect. What's more, the famous Kennedy prediction wasn't as specific as later retellings suggest. In 1960, she actually predicted that Nixon would win the election. The prediction about a Democrat dying in office was vague, made years earlier, and could be interpreted multiple ways. Yet because one interpretation seemed to match reality, it became part of psychic lore, while the contradictory predictions were forgotten. Dixon's career reveals how psychic celebrity functions. Media attention focuses on apparent hits while ignoring the misses. Vague predictions are reinterpreted after events to seem more specific. Probability works in the psychic's favor. If you make enough predictions, some will coincidentally come true. And the public, hungry for certainty about the future, wants to believe that someone can provide it. Uri Geller burst onto the scene in the 1970s with claims that seemed testable and dramatic. He said he could bend spoons and keys through psychokinesis. Mind over matter. Geller would hold a spoon or key, concentrate on it, and it would apparently bend or break without any visible application of force. He claimed to be able to restart broken watches, detect hidden objects, and reproduce drawings sealed in envelopes without seeing them. Geller appeared on television shows worldwide, demonstrating his supposed abilities. He convinced some scientists, including physicists at Stanford Research Institute, that his powers might be genuine. But magicians, particularly James Randi, immediately recognized that everything Geller did could be accomplished through magic tricks. Randi demonstrated this by replicating all of Geller's effects using trickery, explaining the methods in detail. The key to Geller's spoon bending was pre-weakening the spoons through repeated bending, then using misdirection and subtle physical manipulation to complete the bend, while making it look like mental power alone. The watch starting worked because stopped watches often have mechanisms that can be restarted through warmth and movement. Holding a watch and rubbing it provides both. The sealed drawing reproduction used techniques familiar to mentalists and magicians. When Johnny Carson, who had been a magician before becoming a talk show host, had Geller on The Tonight Show in 1973, he consulted with Randi beforehand to prevent trickery. Carson provided the spoons, sealed the envelopes, and controlled the conditions. Geller's performance that night was notably poor. None of his demonstrations worked properly, and he claimed the conditions were affecting his powers. For skeptics, this failure under controlled conditions was telling. For believers, it showed that psychic abilities were fragile and didn't perform well under hostile scrutiny. Geller's career continues today, and he maintains that his abilities are genuine. He's amassed considerable wealth, owns multiple properties, and remains a celebrity in some circles. Whether he genuinely believes in his abilities or knowingly uses tricks is unknown. Some performers become so immersed in their acts that the line between performance and belief blurs. What's clear is that his claims haven't been verified under properly controlled scientific conditions, and everything he does can be replicated through known magic techniques. Sylvia Browne represented the modern television psychic, appearing regularly on shows like Larry King Live and The Montel Williams Show from the 1990s, until her death in 2013. She offered readings to audience members, claimed to speak with the dead, and made predictions about missing persons, future events, and audience members' personal lives. She wrote numerous books and offered phone readings through a paid service. Browne's accuracy, when checked, was poor. She told the family of missing child Sean Hornbeck that he was dead when he was actually found alive years later. She told the family of kidnapping victim Amanda Berry that their daughter was dead when Berry was later found alive. She made specific predictions about world events, crimes, and disasters that didn't come true. Skeptical organizations that tracked her predictions found accuracy rates no better than chance. Yet Brown remained popular because she provided what people wanted: comfort, answers, and apparent connection with deceased loved ones. Her readings followed classic cold reading patterns, with vague statements, fishing for information, and the confidence to make definite claims even when clearly wrong. She didn't let accuracy get in the way of certainty, which paradoxically made her more convincing to believers. People want psychics to be confident, not hedging and uncertain. Modern celebrity psychics like John Edward, Teresa Caputo, Long Island medium, and Tyler Henry, Hollywood medium, continue this tradition. They work primarily with bereaved individuals, claiming to receive messages from deceased loved ones. Their television shows follow similar patterns. Emotional readings where vague statements are made, subjects fill in details, and the psychic claims credit for accuracy. Skeptics note that these shows are edited, potentially allowing for research on subjects beforehand, and that the techniques used match cold reading patterns exactly. What all these famous psychics share is the gap between claimed abilities and verified accuracy. None have been able to demonstrate their abilities under properly controlled scientific conditions. None have won the numerous challenges and prizes offered for proof of psychic abilities, such as James Randi's $1 Million Challenge. Yet all have found devoted followers, commercial success, and cultural influence. This reveals something important. Psychic fame doesn't depend on accuracy. It depends on performance, confidence, media savvy, and providing what audiences want. People consulting psychics often desperately want the psychic to be right. They're grieving, confused, or seeking guidance. They interpret vague statements charitably, fill in details themselves, and remember hits while forgetting misses. The psychic doesn't need to be accurate. They need to be convincing, comforting, and confident. The ethics of psychic practice remain controversial. Critics argue that psychics exploit vulnerable people, charge unconscionable fees for cold reading techniques, and sometimes cause genuine harm with inaccurate information. Imagine being told your missing child is dead when they're actually alive. Defenders respond that psychics provide comfort and counseling, that clients value the experience regardless of supernatural authenticity, and that as long as people are willing to pay, there's no deception beyond what any spiritual advisor might engage in. During the Cold War, in the shadowy realm of intelligence operations, something remarkable was happening. The United States government was seriously investigating whether psychic abilities could be weaponized. For over 2 decades, from the early 1970s to the mid-1990s, the CIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, and other organizations funded programs to study and develop what they called remote viewing, the supposed ability to perceive distant locations and events through psychic means. These programs remained classified for years, and when they were finally declassified, they revealed a fascinating chapter in psychic history where science fiction met intelligence operations, where desperate Cold War competition led to exploration of the seemingly impossible. The story begins with Cold War paranoia and competition. In the 1960s and early 70s, American intelligence agencies received concerning reports. The Soviets were supposedly investigating psychic phenomena, potentially developing psychic spies who could view American military installations from afar, influence enemy thoughts, or even kill at a distance through mental power alone. Whether these Soviet programs were real or exaggerated didn't matter. The possibility that the Soviets might gain a psychic intelligence advantage was enough to prompt American investigation. In 1972, the CIA began funding research at Stanford Research Institute, now SRI International, where physicists Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ were investigating what they believed were genuine psychic phenomena. The initial research subject was Ingo Swann, a New York artist who claimed he could psychically perceive distant locations. Swann's demonstrations impressed the researchers enough that funding continued and the program expanded. The remote viewing protocol they developed was meant to be scientific and replicable. A viewer would be given coordinate numbers, supposedly corresponding to a location. They would then enter a meditative state and describe or sketch what they perceived at that location. The information they produced would be compared to actual photographs or descriptions of the target site. If the viewer's information matched better than chance would predict, this would suggest genuine psychic ability. Early results seemed promising. Viewers sometimes produced sketches or descriptions that seemed to match target locations in ways that impressed researchers. A famous case involved remote viewer Pat Price describing a Soviet military installation in Kazakhstan, providing details about buildings and activities that allegedly matched later satellite reconnaissance. Another involved Joe McMoneagle, one of the military's most tested remote viewers, describing a new type of Soviet submarine under construction, details that supposedly aligned with later intelligence. The program went through various names and organizational homes: Gondola Wish, Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sunstreak, and finally Stargate. Over 2 decades, it employed about 23 remote viewers at various times, most of them military intelligence personnel. They worked on thousands of remote viewing sessions, targeting everything from suspected terrorist locations to missing aircraft to Soviet military facilities. The program cost approximately $20 million in total. But here's where the story gets complicated. When the program was finally declassified and evaluated by independent researchers, the conclusions were far less impressive than believers hoped. The American Institutes for Research conducted a comprehensive assessment in 1995 and found that while some remote viewing sessions produced interesting results, there was no evidence the information was actually useful for intelligence purposes. The hits weren't better than you'd expect from chance, combined with fuzzy targets and generous interpretation. Jessica Utz, a statistician who evaluated the program, concluded that the statistical evidence suggested something anomalous might be happening, that results were better than pure chance. But Ray Hyman, another statistician who reviewed the same data, found methodological problems that could explain the results. Inadequate randomization, sensory cues, and subjective judging that favored positive interpretations. Even Utz acknowledged that even if remote viewing showed statistical effects, it was too unreliable to be operationally useful. The practical problems with remote viewing as an intelligence tool were numerous. The information produced was often vague, requiring generous interpretation to match targets. Viewers couldn't reliably turn their abilities on and off. They couldn't target specific information on demand. Even when sessions produced interesting results, there was no way to know which sessions would be accurate and which would be misses without already having independent confirmation, which made the whole exercise somewhat circular. Stories from former viewers reveal both belief and uncertainty. Joe McMoneagle, who became one of the program's most vocal advocates, describes experiences he found genuinely remarkable and unexplainable through normal means. He believes remote viewing is real, but acknowledges it's not reliable enough for most intelligence applications. Other viewers describe frustration with the ambiguity of their perceptions, the difficulty of distinguishing genuine information from imagination, and the challenge of satisfying demanding intelligence officers who wanted specific actionable data. The Soviet programs that partly inspired the American research turned out to be less impressive than feared. After the Cold War ended, researchers learned that Soviet psychic research was more limited and less successful than American intelligence had believed. The Soviets had investigated telepathy, psychokinesis, and remote viewing, but they'd encountered the same problems American researchers faced. Interesting anecdotes, but no reliable, repeatable effects that could be weaponized or used operationally. What makes the government psychic programs historically significant isn't whether remote viewing is real. That remains hotly debated. What's significant is that the programs existed at all, that serious money and effort went into investigating phenomena that mainstream science considered impossible. It reveals how Cold War anxiety pushed both superpowers into investigating anything that might provide advantage, no matter how unlikely. It shows how difficult it is to prove or disprove psychic phenomena even with substantial funding and motivated researchers. The declassified documents from these programs have become treasured resources for both believers and skeptics. Believers point to successful remote viewing sessions, to the fact that programs continued for 2 decades, suggesting they must have provided some value, and to testimony from participants who remain convinced they experienced genuine psychic phenomena. Skeptics point to the evaluation showing no operational value, to methodological problems in the research, and to the fact that the programs were eventually discontinued as ineffective. What's particularly interesting is how participants describe their experiences. They weren't charlatans or frauds. They were sincere people, many with military backgrounds, who genuinely believed they were accessing information through non-ordinary means. Their descriptions of the remote viewing state sound similar to deep meditation or self-hypnosis. Relaxed focus, mental imagery, intuitive impressions rather than clear perception. Whether these impressions were psychic or purely psychological, the phenomenology, the subjective experience, was real to them. The government psychic programs also influenced popular culture. Books, documentaries, and films have explored these programs, often romanticizing or exaggerating their successes. The idea of psychic spies captured public imagination, feeding into fantasies about secret government programs, hidden knowledge, and the possibility that psychic abilities might be real if even the government investigated them. This cultural impact might outlast the program's actual intelligence value. Some former program participants now offer remote viewing training courses, teaching techniques they learned in the government programs. They describe remote viewing as a learnable skill, not necessarily a supernatural gift, something that can be developed through practice and proper protocols. These courses attract everyone from curiosity seekers to people genuinely believing they might develop psychic abilities. Whether what they're learning is genuine perception of distant locations or elaborate self-delusion remains, as always, debated. The story of government psychic programs reminds us that belief in psychic phenomena isn't limited to the credulous or uneducated. Serious people in serious institutions pursued these investigations with genuine resources and effort. They encountered the same challenges that have always plagued psychic research. Results that seemed promising in some contexts disappeared under stricter controls. Statistical anomalies that might suggest something interesting but weren't reliable or useful. And the fundamental difficulty of studying phenomena that, if they exist at all, are apparently shy, fragile, and resistant to the kind of rigorous investigation that science requires. Let's try a small experiment together, even though you're likely drifting toward sleep. Think about the last time something surprising happened. Maybe you were thinking of an old friend and they called you out of the blue. Maybe you had a vivid dream that seemed to come true the next day. Maybe you felt an inexplicable urge to take a different route home, only to later learn there had been an accident on your usual path. These moments feel significant, meaningful, even magical. They seem to suggest that something beyond coincidence is at work, that perhaps the universe is sending signals that maybe, just maybe, some form of psychic connection or precognition exists. Now here's the fascinating part. Your brain is designed to have exactly these experiences and to interpret them as meaningful. not because you're foolish or superstitious, but because the same cognitive processes that helped our ancestors survive. Pattern recognition, causal thinking, agency detection naturally produce beliefs in phenomena that feel psychic. Understanding the psychology behind belief in psychic phenomena doesn't diminish the experiences or prove psychic abilities don't exist. Instead, it reveals something beautiful about how human minds work, how we create meaning, and why these beliefs persist across cultures and throughout history. Let's start with pattern recognition, one of humanity's most valuable cognitive abilities. Our ancestors who could detect patterns survived, recognizing that rustling grass might mean a predator, that certain cloud formations predicted rain, that eating particular berries caused illness. The brain became exquisitely tuned to find patterns, correlations, and connections. This skill saved lives, enabling humans to learn from experience and predict future events based on past observations. But here's the catch. Pattern recognition is so valuable that our brains evolved to be oversensitive rather than undersensitive. It's better to see patterns that aren't there, what researchers call false positives, than to miss patterns that are there. If you mistake a stick for a snake, you're briefly startled. If you mistake a snake for a stick, you might be dead. So our brains err on the side of detecting patterns, finding connections, and seeing meaning even in random data. This leads to what's called apophenia, the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random or meaningless data. When you shuffle a deck of cards thoroughly, purely random sequences will occasionally produce runs that seem non-random. 5 hearts in a row or sequential numbers. Your brain notices these patterns and assigns them significance, even though they're exactly what randomness should produce sometimes. The same process makes us notice when we think of someone who then calls, while forgetting the countless times we thought of people who didn't call. Confirmation bias amplifies this effect. Once we've formed a belief, say, that we might have psychic abilities or that a particular psychic is genuine, we unconsciously seek information that confirms this belief while discounting information that contradicts it. If you believe you're telepathic with your best friend, you'll notice the times you both text simultaneously and think, psychic connection. You'll forget the far more numerous times one of you texted and the other didn't, or you texted about completely different things. Memory plays crucial tricks here. Our memories aren't video recordings but reconstructions, and they're heavily influenced by our current beliefs and interpretations. If you vaguely remember having a bad feeling before something negative happened, your memory might sharpen that vague unease into a specific premonition when you recall it later. Studies have shown that people who believe they're psychic often remember their hits as more specific and detailed than they actually were, while their misses fade or get reinterpreted. The availability heuristic affects our assessment of psychic experiences too. This is our tendency to judge the probability of events based on how easily examples come to mind. If you've had one vivid experience that felt psychic, a dream that seemed to come true, a strong intuition that proved accurate, this experience will be mentally available, seeming more significant than the 1,000 ordinary days when nothing remarkable happened. The dramatic stands out, the mundane background fades away. Then there's the phenomenon of synchronicity, a term coined by psychologist Carl Jung to describe meaningful coincidences that seem too perfect to be random. You're thinking about Paris, and the next song on the radio mentions Paris, and then you see a billboard advertising flights to Paris. The brain notices this clustering of Paris references and assigns it special meaning. But given how many thoughts we have each day, and how much information we're exposed to, some coincidences are statistically inevitable. They feel remarkable because we don't maintain accurate mental statistics of all the non-coincidences. The Texas sharpshooter fallacy, named after a joke about a marksman who shoots randomly at a barn and then paints targets around the bullet holes, describes how we assess psychic predictions. Psychics often make numerous vague predictions, then later claim credit for the ones that arguably came true while ignoring the misses. We do this ourselves, remembering our correct intuitions as evidence of psychic ability while forgetting our incorrect ones as irrelevant errors. Probability and statistics aren't intuitive for humans. We're notoriously bad at assessing actual likelihood of events. The birthday paradox illustrates this. In a group of just 23 people, there's a better than 50% chance that 2 people share a birthday. This seems impossible to most people, but the math is clear. Similarly, apparently remarkable coincidences are far more common than intuition suggests. Someone dreams about an airplane crash the night before one happens, and it seems psychic. But millions of people have dreams every night, and airplane crashes, while tragic, occur regularly. Some dream crash coincidences are statistically inevitable. The need for control and meaning in an uncertain world powerfully motivates belief in psychic phenomena. Life is genuinely unpredictable. Bad things happen randomly. The future is uncertain. These facts create anxiety. Believing that we or others can access hidden information, that patterns exist that we can discern, that the universe sends meaningful signals. These beliefs provide psychological comfort. They suggest we're not entirely at the mercy of randomness, that agency and intention exist even in seemingly chaotic events. Cultural transmission shapes how we interpret ambiguous experiences. We learn frameworks for understanding unusual experiences from our culture. In medieval Europe, an unusual experience might be interpreted as divine revelation or demonic possession. In modern Western culture, the same experience might be called psychic intuition or a psychological episode. The phenomenology, what the person actually experiences, might be identical, but the interpretation varies based on available cultural frameworks. Social proof influences belief significantly. When others around us believe in psychic phenomena and share stories of their experiences, we're more likely to interpret our own experiences through that lens. This creates communities of belief where shared interpretation reinforces individual conviction. In a family where psychic abilities are accepted and discussed, ambiguous experiences get framed as psychic, and this interpretation feels validated by others' similar stories. The desire to be special also plays a role. Believing you have psychic abilities, even minor ones, sets you apart. It suggests you're sensitive, attuned to frequencies others miss, perhaps spiritually advanced or specially gifted. This appeals to normal human desires for significance and uniqueness. The belief doesn't require evidence that would convince skeptics. It just needs to feel true to the individual and perhaps their immediate community. Emotional states affect how we interpret experiences. Anxiety, grief, stress, and fatigue all make us more likely to perceive meaningful patterns and psychic significance in random events. Someone grieving a death is psychologically primed to notice signs that the deceased is still present. Dreams, coincidences, unusual events all become potential communications from beyond. The brain in distress seeks comfort and meaning wherever it can find them. Interestingly, intelligence and education don't necessarily protect against these cognitive biases. Highly educated people can be just as susceptible to apophenia, confirmation bias, and other thinking errors. Sometimes intelligence can make it worse, because smart people are better at constructing elaborate justifications for beliefs they arrived at through non-rational processes. They can find sophisticated reasons to believe what they want to believe. The psychological concept of locus of control is relevant here. People with external locus of control believe that outside forces, fate, luck, other people, or spiritual entities control their lives. These individuals are more likely to believe in psychic phenomena, seeking external guidance and signs. People with internal locus of control believe they control their own destinies through their choices and actions. They're generally more skeptical of psychic claims, preferring to rely on their own agency rather than external spiritual or psychic forces. Neuroscience has begun identifying brain regions and processes involved in belief and spiritual experiences. Temporal lobe activity has been associated with mystical experiences and feelings of presence. Meditation and prayer produce measurable changes in brain activity. But here's what's fascinating. Identifying the neural correlates of spiritual or psychic experiences doesn't necessarily invalidate them. If belief in psychic connection activates certain neural pathways, does that prove the belief is false, or does it just show how belief manifests in the brain? The interpretation depends on your philosophical framework. The role of intuition deserves special attention. Humans do have genuine intuitive abilities, rapid unconscious processing of complex information that produces gut feelings or hunches. An experienced poker player develops intuitions about other players' hands. A mother develops intuitions about her child's emotional state. These intuitions often prove accurate, and they can feel almost magical in their correctness. But they're based on unconscious processing of subtle cues, pattern recognition from experience, and implicit learning rather than supernatural information access. What makes this tricky is that genuine intuition can feel identical to what people describe as psychic insight. The experienced detective who just knows something about a case might be unconsciously processing behavioral cues, crime patterns, and subtle evidence. But experiencing this as a sudden knowing, absent awareness of the processing, it feels psychic. Distinguishing between excellent intuition and genuine psychic ability becomes philosophically and practically challenging. The need for existential comfort drives belief in many psychic phenomena, particularly those involving communication with the dead or knowledge of the afterlife. Death is the ultimate uncertainty, the ultimate loss of control. Believing that consciousness continues, that we can maintain relationships across death's boundary, that the universe is fundamentally meaningful and purposeful. These beliefs address profound human needs. Whether they're true or not almost becomes secondary to the psychological comfort they provide. What all this psychological research reveals isn't that psychic phenomena definitively don't exist. It reveals that humans will believe in them even if they don't exist, because our cognitive architecture naturally produces these beliefs. We're pattern-seeking, meaning-making, agency-detecting creatures who desperately want the universe to be more than random particles following physical laws. These aren't flaws. They're features of minds evolved for survival in complex social environments. The digital revolution has transformed almost every aspect of human life, and psychic practices are no exception. The medium, that word itself, has taken on new meanings. Who once needed to meet clients in person now offers readings via video call, email, or even AI-enhanced apps. Psychic hotlines have evolved into websites with chat features. Tarot readings happen over Instagram Live, and algorithms claim to predict your future with the same confidence that Victorian spiritualists once brought to seances. The fundamental human needs haven't changed, but the ways we seek to address them have transformed dramatically in the internet age. Let's start with how modern mediumship has adapted to digital platforms. Celebrity mediums like Tyler Henry, who gained fame through his Hollywood medium show, maintain massive social media followings. They post readings, inspirational messages, and announcements about their work to millions of followers. Teresa Caputo, the Long Island medium, turned her reality show into a multimedia empire including books, live tour, and extensive online presence. John Edward continues offering readings decades after his crossing over show, now incorporating streaming and digital content. These modern mediums operate in what's essentially a hybrid model. Traditional one-on-one or small group readings, which have existed for centuries, combined with mass media performance and digital engagement. A single Instagram post might reach hundreds of thousands of people, creating parasocial relationships where fans feel personally connected to the medium without ever having met them. This scalability would have been unimaginable to 19th century spiritualists, yet the core service, claiming to communicate with deceased loved ones, remains identical. The economics of digital psychic services are fascinating. Traditional psychics charged by the session, requiring physical presence. This naturally limited how many clients they could serve and how much they could earn. Digital platforms removed these constraints. A psychic can now offer $50 email readings to hundreds of clients monthly, or charge $500 for a 30-minute video call, or create subscription services where members pay monthly for access to content and occasional group readings. Websites like Keen, Psychic Source, and California Psychics operate as digital marketplaces, employing hundreds of psychics who offer services through phone, chat, or video. The business model resembles other gig economy platforms. The psychics are independent contractors, the platform takes a percentage of fees, and clients rate their experiences. You can browse psychic profiles, read reviews, and choose based on specialties, customer ratings, and per-minute rates. It's Uber, but for talking to the dead. The review systems create interesting dynamics. Positive reviews build a psychic's reputation and lead to more clients. But there's obvious selection bias. People who had satisfying experiences are more likely to leave reviews, while those who felt scammed or disappointed might simply leave without comment. And the reviews often describe feeling comforted or understood rather than factual accuracy, revealing what clients actually value in these interactions. Social media has democratized psychic practice in some ways while intensifying competition in others. Anyone can claim to be psychic on TikTok or Instagram, post reading videos, and build followings. Some offer free mini-readings in comments, then upsell to paid private sessions. Others create content that's more entertainment than genuine claim of service. Aesthetic tarot videos, astrology memes, crystals, and mysticism presented with a wink that acknowledges the performance aspect. The Instagram psychic aesthetic has become its own phenomenon. Moody photography, crystals, candles, cards spread artfully, mystical symbols, and carefully curated feeds that sell not just readings but an entire vibe. These accounts recognize that they're selling an experience and identity as much as information. Following psychic influencers becomes part of spiritual practice, self-care routines, or simply aesthetic appreciation. YouTube hosts countless psychic channels offering general readings for astrological signs, pick-a-card readings where viewers choose from options, and then receive corresponding messages and predictions about collective events. These aren't personalized services, but mass-market spiritual content. They work through the Barnum effect we discussed earlier. General statements that viewers apply to their own situations, finding personal meaning in universal messages. The comment sections on these videos reveal their appeal. People express gratitude for messages that resonated, share their own experiences, and create communities around shared belief. Whether the psychic has genuine abilities becomes almost irrelevant. The content provides comfort, reflection prompts, and social connection. It's part spiritual guidance, part self-help content, part entertainment. Then there are AI psychics and algorithmic fortune-telling. Apps now offer automated tarot readings, astrology reports generated by algorithm, and even AI chatbots that simulate psychic readings. These raise fascinating questions. If an algorithm can provide the same comfort and sense of meaning that a human psychic provides, what does that tell us about what psychic readings actually do? If the value is in reflection, meaning-making, and comfort rather than supernatural information access, then AI might serve the function equally well. CoStar, an astrology app that's gained massive popularity, generates daily horoscopes and compatibility readings based on users' birth data. It uses NASA data for planetary positions combined with astrological interpretation algorithms. The app doesn't claim human psychics are involved. It's openly algorithmic. Yet users find it meaningful, share their readings, and incorporate the app into their daily routines. The technology is new, but the practice, consulting astrological guidance, dates back thousands of years. The rise of digital psychic services has intensified both access and exploitation concerns. On one hand, someone in a small town who might never have encountered a psychic can now access hundreds online. People with mobility limitations or social anxiety can receive services from home. The digital marketplace increases competition, potentially keeping prices reasonable. On the other hand, the same accessibility makes exploitation easier. Someone grieving a sudden death, vulnerable and desperate for connection, can spend thousands of dollars on online readings before recognizing the expense. Automated systems and apps can extract ongoing payments through subscriptions. And the distance and anonymity of online interactions might make some practitioners less accountable than they would be in face-to-face communities. Regulation remains minimal and inconsistent. Some platforms require psychics to include disclaimers that readings are for entertainment purposes, avoiding legal liability. But this creates odd dissonance. The psychic presents their work seriously, while fine print says it's just for fun. Consumer protection is complicated because how do you prove a psychic reading was fraudulent? The service provided is inherently subjective and unfalsifiable. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated digital transformation of psychic services, as it did for so many industries. Psychics who had relied on in-person readings at psychic fairs, private sessions, or storefront practices had to move online or lose income. Many discovered that digital services worked fine, sometimes better than in person. Clients appreciated convenience, and psychics could reach broader markets. This raises questions about what's actually necessary for psychic readings to work. If readings are equally effective via video call as in person, what does that suggest about the mechanics? Skeptics argue it reveals that subtle in-person cues aren't actually necessary, because the readings rely on cold reading and Barnum statements that work in any medium. Believers might say it demonstrates that psychic abilities transcend physical proximity. Digital platforms have also enabled new forms of verification and debunking. Skeptics can record video calls, screenshot conversations, and document predictions for later verification. Online communities share experiences with specific psychics, warning about scams or praising accurate readers. This collective knowledge can protect consumers, but also sometimes creates pylon effects where negative reviews multiply and might not all be fair. The intersection of technology and ancient practice creates fascinating cultural moments. Someone might consult an AI tarot app while commuting on the subway, receiving algorithmically generated mystical guidance on their smartphone, a device that would seem like magic to our ancestors, used to access digital versions of practices those ancestors might recognize. The technology is cutting edge, the human needs are ancient. What's particularly interesting is how little the core appeal has changed despite technological transformation. People consulting online psychics want the same things that brought people to ancient oracles: guidance about relationships, career direction, health concerns, and connection with deceased loved ones. The interface has changed from temple priestess to video call, from incense smoke to emoji, but the questions remain remarkably consistent. The digital age has also enabled new forms of community around psychic beliefs. Online forums, subreddit communities, Discord servers, and Facebook groups connect believers who might be isolated in their physical communities. These digital spaces provide validation, shared experiences, and collective exploration of beliefs that might be dismissed or ridiculed offline. The anonymity and distance of online interaction makes it safer to discuss beliefs that might seem weird to coworkers or family. But digital platforms also enable more sophisticated skeptical analysis. James Randi's work debunking psychics reached limited audiences through books and occasional TV appearances. Now, skeptical YouTubers can post detailed analyses of psychic performances, reaching millions. Websites document psychics' failed predictions. Social media allows quick fact-checking of claims. The same technology that enables psychic services also enables their critical examination. Looking ahead, we can anticipate continued technological integration with psychic practices. Virtual reality seances might create immersive experiences of communicating with the dead. Augmented reality could overlay spiritual information onto physical spaces. Machine learning might generate increasingly sophisticated personalized readings. Blockchain could potentially create verifiable prediction records, though psychics might not embrace this level of accountability. What seems unlikely to change is the fundamental human desire for guidance, meaning, and connection that drives psychic consultation. Technology changes the medium, but not the message. Whether seeking wisdom from an ancient oracle, a Victorian medium, or a contemporary psychic's Instagram account, people are asking eternal questions. What should I do? What does the future hold? Are my loved ones okay? Do my struggles have meaning? Is there more to reality than what I can see and touch? The digital age has made psychic services more accessible, more varied, and more visible than ever before. Whether this democratization is positive, providing comfort and community to more people, or negative, enabling exploitation and spreading misinformation, depends on perspective and individual cases. What's clear is that as long as humans seek meaning beyond the material, as long as grief and uncertainty persist, psychic practitioners will adapt to whatever technological platforms emerge, offering ancient comfort through ever-newer interfaces. We've traveled far together tonight, from ancient oracles to AI fortune tellers, from government remote viewing programs to Instagram psychics. We've examined cold reading techniques and cognitive biases, explored famous mediums and their claims, and considered both skeptical and believing perspectives. But perhaps it's time to sit with something more subtle, more personal, and ultimately more mysterious. Those experiences that don't fit neatly into either the psychic abilities are real, or it's all explainable psychology categories. Because here's the truth, most people at some point in their lives have experiences that feel inexplicable. You dream of something that then happens. You think of someone you haven't spoken to in years, and they call within hours. You have an overwhelming urge to take a different route, and later learn there was an accident on your usual path. You walk into a place you've never been and feel certain you've been there before. You sense something about a person that proves accurate despite having no logical basis for the knowledge. These experiences are common. Studies suggest that over half of people report having had at least one experience they considered psychic or paranormal. These aren't unusual or rare, they're a normal part of human life. Yet they exist in this strange territory where both the it's all coincidence and psychology, and its genuine psychic ability explanations feel somehow inadequate to the actual experience. Let's sit with some of these categories of unexplained experiences, not to explain them away or to prove them supernatural, but simply to acknowledge their reality in human life. Premonitory dreams are among the most commonly reported psychic experiences. You dream of an event, and then something matching that dream occurs. The famous example is of people who canceled tickets on the Titanic after having bad dreams about the voyage. More commonly, people dream of receiving unexpected news, and the next day, that news arrives. Or they dream of a friend in distress, and later learn the friend was experiencing a crisis at that time. Skeptical explanations exist. We dream prolifically. Several dreams per night, most forgotten. With so many dreams and so many daily events, some coincidental matches are inevitable. Dreams are often vague enough to match multiple possible events. We remember dreams that seem to come true while forgetting the vast majority that don't. The brain selectively attends to confirmatory instances. But people who have experienced vivid, detailed premonitory dreams often find these explanations unsatisfying. When you dream about your grandmother's death with specific details, and she dies the next day in the manner dreamed, calling it coincidence feels like dismissing something profound. Maybe it is coincidence, but it's a coincidence that feels significant, and the feeling itself is real regardless of the mechanism. Telepathic experiences between close relatives or partners are frequently reported. Twins speak of knowing when their twin is in distress. Mothers describe knowing something is wrong with their children before receiving any normal communication. Long-married couples finish each other's sentences or simultaneously think of the same obscure topic. These experiences contribute to beliefs about psychic connections between bonded individuals. The psychological explanation involves deep familiarity. When you know someone extremely well, you unconsciously track patterns in their behavior, moods, and thinking. You pick up subtle cues that you process below conscious awareness. You develop mental models of how they think and feel. This allows for apparently psychic knowledge that's actually sophisticated intuition based on years of close observation. This explanation is compelling and probably accounts for many such experiences, but it doesn't quite capture the phenomenology, the felt sense of directly knowing something about another person's experience without inference or deduction. The explanation may be correct, while still feeling incomplete to those who have had these experiences. Synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seem too perfect to be random, occupy fascinating psychological territory. Jung believed synchronicities reflected something profound about the interconnected nature of reality, that they weren't random coincidences, but meaningful alignments between inner psychic states and outer events. You're thinking deeply about a problem, and a stranger's overheard conversation seems to contain the answer you needed. You're struggling with a decision, and you keep encountering the same symbol or sign that seems to point a direction. Skeptics explain synchronicities through probability. With enough events and enough potential connections, some matches are inevitable. Combined with selective attention that notices confirming instances while ignoring non-instances, the meaningful feeling we assign to these coincidences comes from our pattern-seeking brains, not from actual hidden connections in reality. But what if both things are true? What if synchronicities are indeed random coincidences that we notice because of cognitive biases, and the meaning we derive from them is genuinely valuable regardless of whether the universe intentionally sent a message? The psychological benefit of finding meaning and guidance might be real even if the mechanism is entirely internal. Near-death experiences often include elements people describe as psychic or supernatural. Out-of-body perceptions where people report seeing events they couldn't have witnessed from their physical location, encounters with deceased relatives, profound knowledge or insight that seems to come from beyond ordinary consciousness. While near-death experiences are complex phenomena involving neurology, psychology, and culture, some aspects remain difficult to explain fully. Reports of people accurately describing medical procedures performed while they were clinically unconscious, and their eyes were closed present interesting challenges. Skeptics propose that people might have brief moments of consciousness not detected by monitoring, might incorporate information heard while seeming unconscious, or might construct memories after the fact based on reasonable assumptions about what probably happened. These explanations are plausible, but difficult to prove definitively in individual cases. The phenomenon of crisis apparitions, seeing or sensing someone at the moment they die or experience a severe crisis despite being separated by distance, has been reported across cultures and throughout history. Someone sees their mother standing at the foot of their bed, only to learn the next morning that their mother died during the night at that time. These experiences are subjective and cannot be verified, yet they're reported consistently enough to warrant consideration. Psychological explanations might involve dream experiences incorrectly remembered as waking events, coincidental timing remembered more accurately than it actually was, or the brain's tendency to create vivid hallucinations during transitional states between sleep and waking. Yet for the person who experiences seeing their dying mother clearly, being told it was a hypnopompic hallucination doesn't quite address the profound emotional significance of the experience. Collective or shared experiences present particular challenges for both skeptical and believing frameworks. When multiple people report the same unusual experience, seeing the same apparition, feeling the same presence in a location, or receiving the same message from a medium, how do we interpret this? Mass hallucination is possible but rare. Shared expectation and suggestion can create similar experiences. Yet sometimes the details of agreement seem more specific than these explanations comfortably account for. The question of evidence always arises. Psychic experiences are typically personal, subjective, and difficult to verify objectively. They happen in contexts that don't allow for controlled observation. They're remembered rather than recorded, and memory is unreliable. The very nature of these experiences resists the kind of documentation and verification that science requires. But perhaps that's okay. Perhaps not everything that's real and meaningful needs to be scientifically verified. The significance of these experiences to the people who have them is undeniable. They shape beliefs, provide comfort, influence decisions, and contribute to how people understand themselves and reality. Whether they involve actual psychic abilities or arise entirely from psychology and coincidence, they're genuine parts of human experience. What's interesting is how these experiences persist across cultures, eras, and individual differences. The specific interpretation varies. Spirits, telepathy, angels, collective unconscious, quantum consciousness. But the experiences themselves show remarkable consistency. People separated by continents and centuries describe similar phenomena. This universality might suggest something real underlying the experiences, or it might simply reveal consistent features of human psychology and neurology. The honest position might be one of open-minded uncertainty. We don't fully understand consciousness. We don't completely comprehend how brains process information or how meaning emerges from neural activity. The boundaries between self and other, between inner experience and outer reality, aren't as clear as we sometimes assume. Given these genuine mysteries, dogmatic certainty, either that psychic phenomena definitely exist or definitely don't, seems premature. What we can say is that humans consistently have experiences they interpret as psychic or supernatural. These experiences feel real and significant. They serve psychological functions, providing comfort, meaning, and connection. Whether they involve abilities beyond current scientific understanding or arise entirely from known psychological and neurological processes, they reveal something important about human consciousness, our need for meaning, and our complex relationship with the mysterious. For some people, these experiences confirm belief in psychic abilities or spiritual realities beyond the material. For others, they're interesting psychological phenomena worth understanding better. For many, the experiences exist in ambiguous territory where neither full belief nor full skepticism feels quite right. And perhaps that uncertainty, that acknowledgement of mystery, is the most honest position. Tonight, we've journeyed together through thousands of years of human fascination with abilities that transcend ordinary perception. We've explored the psychology that makes us prone to believing in psychic phenomena, the techniques that can simulate supernatural abilities, and the honest mystery of experiences that resist both simple belief and simple dismissal. We've seen how the fundamental human questions remain constant even as the cultural contexts shift. We still want guidance about uncertain futures, connection with lost loved ones, and evidence that consciousness transcends the purely physical. Whether psychic abilities are real, imagined, or something more complex than either category allows, they reveal profound truths about human nature, our need for meaning, and our eternal relationship with mystery. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the fascinating, controversial, and eternally debatable world of psychics. If you're already drifting off, then our mission is complete. But if you're still awake, perhaps another deep dive through one of our previous episodes will carry you gently into slumber. Until we meet again in these quiet hours, may you trust your intuitions without surrendering your skepticism. May you remain open to mystery while grounded in kindness. And may the questions that have no easy answers lead you toward wonder rather than worry.